The morning sun filtered through my apartment window in downtown Milwaukee as I carefully selected my outfit for what would become the most challenging day of my professional life. At 34 years old, I had worked my way up through the ranks of the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, earning my position as the new district health inspector through years of dedication and countless hours of study. My name is Madison Sinclair, and I believed in doing things differently. Rather than announcing my arrival with fanfare and giving restaurants time to polish their operations into a false shine, I had decided to spend my first unofficial day visiting kitchens quietly, observing their real practices when they thought no one important was watching. I pulled on a pair of worn sneakers that had seen better days, twisted my auburn hair into a messy bun that suggested I'd barely had time to get ready, and chose a simple t-shirt and jeans that would help me blend in with the stream of job seekers who regularly appeared at restaurant doors hoping for work. The reflection staring back at me from the hallway mirror looked nothing like the professional inspector I would officially become on Monday. This was exactly the effect I wanted. Years of experience had taught me that the best way to understand a workplace's true culture was to see how they treated those they perceived as powerless. The first two restaurants on my list had been relatively uneventful, revealing minor violations that could be easily corrected with proper guidance. But as I approached the Lakeside Grill, an upscale establishment overlooking Lake Michigan that catered to Milwaukee's business elite, a knot formed in my stomach. During my orientation, veteran inspectors had warned me about this place with knowing looks and careful words. The head chef, Randy Morrison, was described as untouchable, a man whose connections in the culinary world ran so deep that previous attempts to address violations had mysteriously disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. I entered through the delivery entrance, my sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished concrete floor. The kitchen was already in full swing despite the early hour. Prep cooks chopping vegetables with practiced precision, while the sweet aroma of caramelizing onions mixed with the sharp scent of fresh herbs. At the center of it all stood Randy Morrison, a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire space. He was perhaps 45 years old, with salt and pepper hair kept short and precise, wearing chef's whites that looked professionally pressed even in the midst of morning prep work. His movements were economical and confident as he worked at his station, occasionally barking orders that sent his team scurrying. When I approached his prep station, Randy didn't even glance up from the salmon he was expertly filleting. His knife moved with surgical precision, separating the pink flesh from silver skin in smooth, practiced strokes. The dismissal came before I could even speak, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "Kitchen's not hiring," he said, his tone suggesting this wasn't the first time he'd had to deliver this message today. "Hostess applications are at the front," and he gestured vaguely toward the dining room with his knife, the blade catching the overhead lights. Before I could respond or clarify my presence, his hands were on my shoulders, physically turning me around with a firmness that spoke of someone accustomed to moving people like chess pieces. The touch wasn't violent, but it was undeniably controlling, treating me like an object that had been misplaced rather than a person who deserved basic courtesy. The dismissal was so casual, so practiced, that I realized this was likely a daily occurrence for him, turning away hopeful job seekers without a second thought or a moment of consideration. Something in me refused to accept this treatment, perhaps the same stubborn streak that had driven me to work my way through night school while waiting tables, earning my degree in public health while learning firsthand how restaurants operated from the ground up. I planted my feet and turned back to face him, keeping my voice calm and professional despite the heat rising in my cheeks. "I have experience in food service," I said, meeting his gaze directly and refusing to be intimidated by his dismissive attitude. That got his attention in the worst possible way. Randy finally looked up from his work, and his laugh was so loud and mocking that it echoed through the kitchen, causing every member of his team to stop what they were doing and turn to watch the show. His eyes, a cold gray that reminded me of storm clouds over the lake, swept over me from head to toe with an assessment that made my skin crawl. "Free entertainment, guys," he called out to his team, his voice dripping with condescension. "Another one who thinks watching cooking shows makes them a chef. Let's see what we have here." He began to circle me slowly, like a predator sizing up prey, and his voice shifted into a baby talk that was clearly designed to humiliate. "Does the Whittle girl know how to hold a knife properly? Can she wash a dishy-wishy without breaking a nail? The other cooks laughed nervously, the kind of uncomfortable laughter that comes from people who know they're witnessing something wrong but are too afraid to speak up. I noticed how some of the younger staff members looked away, their discomfort evident in their rigid postures and downcast eyes. One of Randy's loyal lieutenants, a sous chef whose name tag read Derek, decided to join in the fun. He dragged over an enormous bus tub filled with dirty plates, the remnants of what must have been the previous night's service, and dropped it in front of me with a crash that sent a few forks clattering to the floor. "Show us you can handle the easiest job in the kitchen first, princess," Derek said, his voice mimicking Randy's mocking tone. "Maybe if you're really good, we'll let you look at a real recipe." I began washing dishes without complaint, keeping my expression neutral while Randy continued his performance for his audience. The water was scalding hot, and I noticed they hadn't provided me with gloves, a clear health code violation that I mentally filed away. As I worked, Randy kept up a running commentary about my technique, my appearance, and what he imagined my motivations might be for wanting to work in his kitchen. His theories grew increasingly inappropriate, suggesting I was either looking for a rich husband among the clientele or trying to sleep my way into a position. When I finished the first tub and reached for a container of herbs to examine their freshness, Randy's harassment escalated to dangerous levels. He suddenly turned on the burner directly under my hand, and flames shot up with a whoosh that made me jerk back instinctively. My sleeve caught the edge of the flame, and I had to pat it out quickly while Randy laughed at my reaction. "Just testing your reflexes, sweetheart," he said with false innocence. "Can't have clumsy people in my kitchen. You could have gotten seriously hurt there if you weren't paying attention." The game continued to escalate when he shoved a spoon directly at my face, the hot liquid nearly burning my lips. "Taste this sauce," he commanded, then added in a voice dripping with innuendo, "Open up for me." Before I could respond or step back, he pressed the spoon against my closed lips, trying to force them open while making crude comments about what else I might be willing to open up for the right opportunity. When I turned my head away, he grabbed my chin with his free hand, his fingers digging in just hard enough to leave marks. The kitchen had gone eerily quiet, except for the sound of sizzling pans and the distant hum of refrigeration units. I could feel the eyes of every staff member on us, waiting to see how far Randy would push this scene. When I managed to pull away from his grip, he decided to test what he called my reflexes by dropping a knife near my feet. The blade clattered on the floor inches from my worn sneakers, and I had to jump back to avoid it. The motion made Randy laugh again, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Turn around," Randy commanded, his voice taking on a harder edge when I didn't immediately comply with his demands. "Let's see if you'll distract my line cooks with that ass." When I hesitated, unwilling to participate in this degrading display, he took matters into his own hands, spinning me roughly by the shoulders. His hands lingered far longer than necessary, sliding down my arms before settling on my waist. "Not bad from behind," he announced to his audience, though I noticed several of them looked deeply uncomfortable with the direction this was taking. "Now bend over and get that pot from the bottom shelf. I need to see if you can follow simple instructions." When I crouched instead of bending over as he'd commanded, Randy's facade of playfulness cracked slightly. He grabbed my arm and pulled me back up with enough force to make me stumble. "I said, bend over," he repeated, his breath hot on my neck as he positioned himself directly behind me. "Need to see if you can take direction. This is a professional kitchen, not a democracy. You do exactly what the chef tells you, exactly how he tells you to do it." His fingers moved to adjust my apron from behind, taking an extraordinarily long time to tie the strings while pressing against me in a way that made my stomach turn. "My apartment's upstairs," he whispered directly into my ear, his lips close enough that I could feel them brush against my skin. "I think we should discuss your qualifications more privately. I know exactly what kind of qualifications you really have, and I'm very interested in exploring them further." When I tried to step away from this increasingly threatening situation, Randy grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His thumb traced along my palm, in what he clearly thought was a seductive gesture, while he maintained his grip. "Let me show you the proper grip," he said loud enough for others to hear, as if this was still somehow part of legitimate kitchen instruction. His other hand covered mine on an imaginary knife handle, and he pressed against me from behind in a pantomime of teaching that fooled no one. I finally managed to pull away completely, putting several feet between us. And that's when Randy's entire demeanor shifted from predatory playground bully to something far more dangerous. His face darkened with anger at being rejected, and he pulled out his phone with theatrical deliberation. The kitchen held its collective breath as he aimed the camera at me, making sure to catch me at my worst angle while I was still flushed and upset from his harassment. "Look at this face," he said, immediately showing the photo to his nearest cooks while simultaneously uploading it to his phone. "This is the face of someone who thinks she can play games with Randy Morrison. This photo is going to every kitchen in the state by tonight. They'll know exactly what kind of girl comes begging for work and then acts too good for the chef." His fingers flew over his phone screen as he spoke, and I could see he already had a restaurant industry group chat open with hundreds of members. "I'll tell them you're an escort who targets restaurants," he continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "That you come in pretending to want a job, then try to blackmail chefs with false accusations. One message from me and you're done forever in this industry. No legitimate kitchen will let you through the door. You'll be lucky to get a job at a fast food drive-thru when I'm done with you." The threats poured out of him with practiced ease, suggesting this wasn't the first time he'd used his network as a weapon. Before I could move or respond, Randy's hand shot out and snatched my wallet from my back pocket. The violation of having him reach into my clothing made me freeze momentarily, which gave him time to pull out my driver's license. He held it up like a trophy, making sure to angle it so his phone camera could capture every detail, particularly my home address. "Now I know where you live too. Madison Sinclair of 4782 Maple Street, apartment 3B. He read aloud, making sure everyone in the kitchen heard my personal information. The kitchen had gone completely silent now, the only sounds coming from equipment that couldn't be turned off. Randy looked around at his staff with a sick smile spreading across his face, clearly enjoying the power he wielded over everyone in the room. "You know what?" he announced, as if he'd just had a brilliant idea. "I think our new friend Madison here needs to cool off and think about her choices. She seems a little too heated, a little too proud. Let's see if some time to reflect changes her attitude." He grabbed my upper arm with bruising force and started dragging me toward the walk-in freezer. I tried to plant my feet, but he was stronger and had the advantage of surprise. As he wrestled me toward the heavy metal door, he called out to his team with cruel glee in his voice, making sure everyone understood what was happening. When I let her out in about 20 minutes, he announced, "She'll either be ready to blow me or she'll never work in this town again. Those are her only two choices. Let's see how tough she is after freezing her ass off for a while." The freezer door slammed shut behind me with a definitive clang, and I heard the click of the lock engaging. The sudden cold hit me like a physical blow, and I wrapped my arms around myself as my breath came out in visible puffs. I immediately checked my watch and pulled out my phone, grateful that Randy hadn't thought to search me for it. As I shivered in the Arctic air, I began making detailed notes of every violation I'd witnessed, every threatening word Randy had spoken, every instance of physical contact and sexual harassment. 20 minutes later, almost to the second, the freezer door swung open. Randy stood there with a self-satisfied smirk, clearly expecting to find me broken and ready to capitulate to whatever demands he might make. "Ready to be reasonable now?" he asked, his tone suggesting he fully expected me to either burst into tears or immediately agree to his earlier proposition. I noticed Derek and several other cooks watching from strategic positions, ready to enjoy whatever humiliation their chef had planned for Act 2 of this performance. I walked out without saying a word, my dignity intact despite the shivering that I couldn't quite control. My silence seemed to infuriate Randy more than tears or pleading would have. As I headed toward the exit, maintaining as much composure as I could manage with my teeth chattering, the kitchen doors burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. The owner, William Chen, strode in with the purposeful gait of someone who had expected to be meeting an important visitor. "Has the health inspector arrived yet?" William asked, slightly out of breath as if he'd been hurrying. "The district office said she'd be here by now for the preliminary walkthrough." His eyes swept the kitchen before landing on me by the freezer door, still visibly shivering from my imprisonment. His expression shifted from confusion to recognition to horror in the space of a heartbeat as he registered who I was and what my condition suggested about what had been happening in his absence. "Inspector Sinclair!" William rushed over, with his hand extended, his face now showing a mix of excitement and growing alarm. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here to greet you properly. I had a meeting with suppliers that ran over. I specifically cleared my schedule to be here for your visit." His handshake was warm and professional, a stark contrast to every interaction I'd had since entering his kitchen. "I hope you've had a chance to observe our operations. Randy here runs a very tight ship, keeps the highest standards." Randy's face had drained of all color, his earlier bravado evaporating like steam from a hot plate. The knife he'd been holding clattered to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had descended over the kitchen. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged, making him look like a fish gasping on a dock. The mighty chef who had terrorized me for the past hour was reduced to speechless panic as the full implications of what he'd done crashed over him. You said you were just..." Randy's stammering attempts at speech finally produced fragments of sentences, each one digging his hole deeper. His hands had started shaking visibly, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the kitchen. The other staff members had begun backing away from him slowly, as if his catastrophic mistake might be contagious. Several of them were exchanging meaningful looks that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd witnessed Randy's behavior, just the first time he'd faced any consequences. Every threat he'd made, every inappropriate touch, every moment of humiliation flashed across Randy's face as he realized the full scope of his error. The health inspector he'd locked in a freezer, threatened with industry blacklisting, and sexually harassed was standing right there, with the owner singing his praises for running a tight ship. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the kitchen, least of all Randy, who looked like he might either vomit or faint at any moment. I walked out of the lakeside grill without saying a single word to either William or Randy, leaving them to contemplate what had just transpired. My silence was more damning than any accusation could have been. As I drove home, my hands still shaking slightly from a combination of cold and adrenaline, I tried to focus on documenting everything while it was fresh in my mind. I had no idea that Randy had already put his vengeful plan into motion, that my photo and home address were spreading through the Milwaukee restaurant community like wildfire, or that a group of his loyal followers were already planning their retaliation. The first indication that something was wrong came when my phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. Someone had added me to a group chat called Milwaukee Food Service Professionals, a forum I'd heard about but never been invited to join. Randy's message glowed on my screen like a toxic spill, each word carefully chosen to cause maximum damage. "Watch out for this one," the message read. "Claims to be a health inspector, but she's just a scammer running a shakedown operation. Showed up at my kitchen demanding a job, then threatened to report fake violations unless I paid her off. Lives at 4782 Maple Street, apartment 3B. Don't let her near your kitchens." Attached was the unflattering photo he'd taken, capturing me at my most vulnerable. My hands trembled as I watched the responses flood in faster than I could read them. Dozens of chefs and restaurant owners from across the Milwaukee metro area were saving my address, sharing the post to their own networks, and adding their own embellishments to Randy's fabricated story. Someone claimed I'd tried the same scam at their restaurant last month, a complete lie that was immediately liked and shared by others. Another posted that they'd heard about similar scams in Chicago and wondered if I was part of a larger ring targeting Midwest restaurants. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex in the trendy 3rd Ward district, the chat had exploded with hundreds of messages. I noticed immediately that something was off. There was a white van I didn't recognize parked near my building, its engine running despite no one being visible inside. My pulse quickened as I climbed the exterior stairs to my 3rd-floor unit, each step feeling heavier than the last. There, taped to my door, was a printout of the photo Randy had taken. Someone had scrawled "liar" across it in red marker that looked disturbingly like blood in the dim hallway light. Inside my apartment, I locked the deadbolt and slid the chain into place before leaning against the door, trying to steady my breathing and think clearly. The place that had always been my sanctuary suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable. My phone continued to buzz with notifications as more restaurant industry people joined the pile-on. each message more vicious than the last. I powered through my initial shock and began the methodical process of documenting everything, screenshotting each threat and lie, saving the metadata, creating a comprehensive timeline of how Randy's fabrication was spreading. My official start date as district health inspector was still 5 days away. 5 days for this situation to spiral completely out of control. 5 days for Randy's lies to solidify into accepted truth within the restaurant community. I opened my laptop and began composing detailed reports of everything that had happened at the Lakeside Grill, from the sexual harassment to the false imprisonment to the current campaign of defamation. Years of training had taught me that documentation was crucial, that contemporary records carried more weight than after-the-fact recollections. The next morning, I woke to aggressive pounding on my door that sent my heart racing before I was even fully conscious. Through the peephole, I saw 2 men in chef's whites, one holding up his phone in the unmistakable posture of someone recording video. I could hear their muffled voices through the door, calling me names and demanding I come out and face them like an adult instead of hiding like the scammer I was. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for them to give up and leave. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they finally departed, but not before I heard one tell the other they'd be back with more people. I couldn't stay trapped in my apartment like a prisoner, allowing Randy's intimidation tactics to control my life. I still had 3 more restaurants on my unofficial pre-inspection list, establishments I'd planned to visit quietly to get a true sense of their operations. I wasn't going to let one narcissistic chef with a god complex derail my entire approach to this job. I dressed in my most professional outfit, a charcoal gray suit that projected authority, gathered all my documentation into a leather portfolio, and prepared to face whatever came next. The back exit of my building led to a small alley that connected to the next street over, allowing me to avoid whoever might be watching the front entrance. My car was parked in a public garage 2 blocks away, a lucky circumstance since I'd been meaning to clean out my designated spot in the building's lot. As I walked briskly through the morning crowd of commuters and dog walkers, I tried to look confident and purposeful rather than like someone fleeing harassment. My second stop of the day was supposed to be Bella's Bistro, a family-owned Italian restaurant in Bayview known for its authentic recipes and warm atmosphere. However, as I approached the entrance, I noticed the owner, Maria Rossetti, standing outside with her phone in her hand, clearly studying something on the screen. When she looked up and saw me, her expression hardened with recognition that made my stomach sink. She had seen Randy's message and believed every word of it. "You need to leave," Maria said before I could even introduce myself properly. Her voice was cold and firm, lacking any of the warmth I'd heard she was famous for. "We don't tolerate scammers here. I run an honest business and I won't have someone like you trying to shake us down with fake violations." The accusation stung more because Maria was known as one of the most ethical restaurateurs in the city, someone who prided herself on maintaining the highest standards without being prompted by inspections. I reached for my official identification, hoping that concrete proof of my position might cut through Randy's web of lies. "Maria, I'm actually the new district health inspector," I began, but she cut me off with a sharp gesture, her hand slicing through the air between us like a knife. Her face had flushed red with anger, and I could see her hands trembling slightly with the effort of controlling her temper. "I don't care what fake ID you've managed to get," she said, her voice rising enough that passers-by began to take notice. "Randy Morrison is a respected chef in this community. If he says you're a scammer, then that's good enough for me. Now get away from my restaurant before I call the police." The threat of police involvement made me retreat, knowing that any confrontation would only fuel Randy's narrative that I was unstable or criminal. As I walked back to my car, I could feel eyes on me from the restaurant windows. Several staff members had gathered to watch the confrontation, and I knew this encounter would be shared and embellished across the same networks where Randy's lies were spreading. My attempt to do my job quietly and effectively was being sabotaged at every turn. My phone rang as I sat in my car trying to decide my next move. The caller ID showed my supervisor at the health department, Connor Matthews, and my heart sank as I answered. "Madison." Connor's voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the concern underneath. "I just received some rather disturbing calls about you. 3 restaurant owners have contacted me this morning claiming you're running some kind of shakedown operation. What's going on?" The fact that Randy's lies had already reached my supervisors showed just how quickly and effectively he'd weaponized his network against me. I explained everything to Connor in detail, from my decision to conduct informal observations to the assault and false imprisonment at Randy's restaurant to the current smear campaign. There was a long pause after I finished, and I could hear Connor's fingers drumming on his desk, a nervous habit I'd noticed during our previous meetings. "This is serious, Madison," he finally said. "Randy Morrison has connections throughout the industry. But if what you're saying is true, and I have no reason to doubt you, then we're dealing with assault, false imprisonment, and coordinated harassment. Document everything and stay safe. We'll handle this through official channels starting Monday." But Monday felt like a lifetime away as the harassment continued to escalate. When I returned to my apartment complex that afternoon, the situation had deteriorated further. The pristine white walls of the hallway leading to my unit had been defaced with spray paint. The words "Liar lives here" in dramatic red letters that dripped like blood in a horror movie. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, poked her head out of her door, her face creased with worry. "There were more people here earlier," she whispered, as if afraid they might still be listening. "They were taking pictures and laughing. I called building security, but they said without proof of who did it, there was nothing they could do." Inside my apartment, I called the police to report the vandalism and harassment. The officer who took my report sounded sympathetic but explained that without concrete evidence of who had done the spray painting or proof of immediate physical threat, their options were limited. They would increase patrols in the area, he assured me, but I could tell from his tone that a dispute between restaurant workers wasn't high on their priority list. I was essentially on my own until Monday, when I could use the official weight of the health department to fight back. That evening, as I sat surrounded by printed screenshots and documentation, my phone rang with an unknown local number. Against my better judgment, I answered it. The voice on the other end was female, young and nervous. "Is this Madison Sinclair?" she asked, and when I confirmed, she continued in a rush. "My name is Rose Walsh. I used to work at the Lakeside Grill. I saw what Randy posted about you, and I know he's lying. He did the same thing to me 2 years ago when I refused to sleep with him. I have evidence, texts, and emails where he threatened to destroy my career. I'm willing to help if you need it." Rose's call was the first ray of hope in what had been a nightmare day. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in the 3rd Ward, a public place where we'd both feel safe. As I prepared for the meeting, I realized that Randy's mistake might have been in assuming all his victims would stay silent forever. His arrogance had led him to believe that his power was absolute, that no one would dare challenge his version of events. But Rose's courage in reaching out suggested that there might be others ready to speak up. The coffee shop was crowded with the after-work crowd when I arrived, young professionals unwinding with expensive lattes and artisanal pastries. Rose was already there, a woman in her late 20s with dark hair and nervous energy that had her constantly stirring her untouched coffee. She looked up when I approached, and I could see the same wariness in her eyes that I probably displayed. 2 women united by shared trauma and the courage to fight back against their abuser. Rose's story poured out in fits and starts, a narrative depressingly similar to my own experience. She had been a line cook at the Lakeside Grill, talented and ambitious, when Randy had begun his campaign of harassment. First came the inappropriate comments about her appearance, then the accidental touches that were anything but accidental. When she'd rejected his advances, he'd made her work life unbearable, assigning her the worst shifts, publicly humiliating her mistakes while ignoring those of male colleagues, and finally threatening to blacklist her throughout Milwaukee's culinary scene. "I kept everything," Rose said, pulling out her phone to show me screenshot after screenshot of Randy's messages. The texts grew progressively more threatening, from "you're making a mistake" to explicit threats about ensuring she'd never work in a kitchen again. "Here's the worst part," she continued, scrolling to a particular thread. "He actually followed through on some of these threats." I applied to 14 restaurants after I left, and every single one told me they'd heard I was trouble. It took me moving to Chicago and starting over completely to escape his reach. As Rose shared her evidence, I began to see the pattern more clearly. Randy wasn't just a chef who'd made a terrible mistake with me. He was a serial predator who had weaponized his position and network to control and abuse women in the industry. The fact that he'd felt comfortable enough to assault and imprison me, a health inspector, in front of his entire staff showed just how invincible he believed himself to be. But now, his arrogance had created an opportunity to expose not just one incident, but a pattern of behavior. My phone buzzed with a text from Connor at the health department. He'd been doing his own investigation and had discovered something interesting. Randy's restaurant had been flagged for violations by previous inspectors, but the reports had been mysteriously modified or lost before any action could be taken. There was also a pattern of female inspectors requesting reassignment after visiting the Lakeside Grill. Though none had filed formal complaints, the picture emerging was of systematic intimidation that had been allowed to continue for years. That night, I worked on connecting the dots between Rose's evidence, my own experience, and the pattern Connor had uncovered. The legal case was building itself with each piece of documentation, each screenshot, each testimony. But I knew that come Monday, I would need more than just evidence of Randy's crimes. I would need to inspect his kitchen thoroughly and professionally, maintaining my integrity despite everything he'd done. The best revenge would be doing my job so well that no one could question my motivations. The weekend passed in a blur of continued harassment and careful documentation. Randy's followers seemed to work in shifts, ensuring that I couldn't leave my apartment without encountering someone ready to confront me with accusations and threats. Food delivery drivers began refusing to come to my address after someone in the restaurant chat warned them I was dangerous. My building's management company called to express concerns about the disturbances, hinting that if the situation continued, they might need to review my lease terms. But for every setback, there was also progress. Rose had reached out to her network, and 2 more women contacted me with similar stories about Randy. A male chef, who had witnessed Randy's behavior but been too afraid to speak up before, offered to provide a statement. Even some people in the restaurant chat began to question Randy's story, noting inconsistencies and wondering why someone would target his restaurant, specifically if they were really running a widespread scam. Sunday night, I sat in my apartment reviewing my inspection checklist for the Lakeside Grill. Every item would be scrutinized with complete objectivity and professionalism. I wouldn't let my personal experience cloud my judgment or give Randy any ammunition to claim the inspection was retaliatory. The evidence would speak for itself, and based on what I'd observed during my visit, there would be plenty of violations to document properly. The walk-in freezer temperature logs, the hand-washing stations, the food storage protocols, all of it would be examined to the letter of the health code. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp fall weather that Milwaukee was famous for. I dressed in my official health inspector uniform, complete with badge and clipboard, armor against whatever Randy might try to throw at me. Connor had insisted on accompanying me for the inspection, both for support and as a witness. As we drove to the Lakeside Grill, he briefed me on additional information he'd uncovered, including 3 previous complaints about food poisoning that had been buried in bureaucratic red tape. The reaction when we walked through the front door of the Lakeside Grill was immediate and dramatic. The hostess's welcoming smile froze when she recognized me, and she immediately fled to the kitchen without a word. We could hear Randy's raised voice from the dining room, though the words were muffled by distance and the soft jazz playing over the sound system. When we entered the kitchen, officially this time, the entire staff froze like a tableau in a museum exhibit. Randy stood at his station, his face cycling through expressions like a slot machine before settling on defensive anger. "You can't do this," he sputtered, pointing his finger at me like a weapon. "This is retaliation for a misunderstanding. I'll have your job for this. I have lawyers. I have connections. You have no idea who you're messing with." His threats might have been more effective if his hands weren't shaking and his voice didn't crack on the last word. Connor stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding respect. "Mr. Morrison," he said in a tone that brooked no argument, "Inspector Sinclair is here to conduct a routine inspection that was scheduled weeks ago. Any attempt to interfere with this inspection will result in additional penalties. I suggest you and your staff cooperate fully." The look Randy shot me over Connor's shoulder was pure venom, but he stepped aside and gestured for us to proceed with elaborate mock courtesy. What followed was the most thorough inspection of my career. Every surface was swabbed, every temperature checked, every record examined. The violations piled up like a damning indictment of Randy's management. Improper food storage temperatures, inadequate hand-washing facilities, mouse droppings in the dry storage area, expired products hidden behind fresh ones, and, crucially, no temperature logs for the walk-in freezer where I'd been imprisoned. The same freezer that Randy had locked me in was being used to store food at improper temperatures, a violation that could sicken customers. Throughout the inspection, I maintained perfect professionalism, speaking only to request records or point out violations to Connor for documentation. Randy followed us around the kitchen, alternating between blustering threats and wheedling attempts to minimize the infractions. His staff watched with expressions ranging from satisfaction to terror, depending on their loyalty to their chef. Several of them took the opportunity to discreetly point out additional violations when Randy's attention was elsewhere. The coup de grace came when we requested employee records and training certifications. Multiple staff members were working without proper food handlers' permits, and the required safety training documentation was either missing or obviously forged. When we examined the employee files more closely, we discovered that Randy had been systematically hiring undocumented workers and paying them below minimum wage, using their vulnerable status to ensure their silence about kitchen conditions and his behavior. By the time we finished the inspection, the Lakeside Grill was facing immediate closure pending corrections of critical violations. The list of infractions was so extensive that it would take weeks and significant investment to bring the restaurant up to code. William Chen, the owner, arrived halfway through the inspection, his face growing paler with each violation we documented. His earlier enthusiasm about Randy's management had transformed into horror as he realized the liability his chef had created. Randy's final attempt at salvage came as we were preparing to leave. He cornered me near the exit while Connor was speaking with William, his voice low and desperate. "We can work this out," he said, all traces of his earlier arrogance gone. "I know people. I can make that chat disappear, tell everyone I was mistaken. Just give me a chance to fix things." The violations, I mean. Not the other stuff. We both know that was just a misunderstanding. You came in dressed like... how was I supposed to know? I looked at him steadily, seeing him clearly for the first time. Without his kitchen kingdom and network of enablers, Randy Morrison was just a middle-aged man who had built his career on the exploitation and abuse of others. His power had always been an illusion sustained by fear and complicity. "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Morrison," I replied calmly. "Any communication regarding this inspection should go through official channels. However, you should know that I've filed a police report regarding the assault and false imprisonment, and I'm pursuing defamation charges for your online harassment campaign." The look of shock on Randy's face was almost worth everything I'd endured. He genuinely hadn't considered that there might be consequences beyond the health code violations. As I walked out of the Lakeside Grill for the last time, I could hear him behind me, frantically calling his lawyer, his voice high with panic. The mighty chef Randy Morrison, who had terrorized workers for years, was finally facing accountability. The aftermath of the inspection moved quickly. By that afternoon, news of the Lakeside Grill's closure had spread throughout Milwaukee's restaurant community. The same chat where Randy had tried to destroy my reputation was now filled with discussions of the violations found and speculation about what had really happened. Some of Randy's supporters tried to maintain the narrative that I was retaliating for being rejected, but the sheer scope and documentation of the violations made that story increasingly difficult to sustain. Rose and the other women who had come forward met with attorneys to discuss their options. The evidence we'd compiled painted a picture of systematic harassment and abuse that opened Randy to both civil and criminal liability. The restaurant industry's Het Me Too moment had arrived in Milwaukee, and Randy Morrison was about to become its poster child for consequences. Employment attorneys began reaching out, offering to represent the victims pro bono, sensing both justice and publicity in taking down such a prominent predator. The criminal case moved forward on multiple fronts. The assault and false imprisonment charges were straightforward, given the witness testimony from kitchen staff who had watched Randy lock me in the freezer. Several of them, freed from fear of retaliation by Randy's downfall, provided detailed statements about what they'd seen and heard. The security footage from the kitchen, which William Chen voluntarily provided, clearly showed Randy physically dragging me to the freezer while making his threatening announcements. The cyberstalking and harassment charges were equally solid. The digital trail Randy had left was extensive and damning. Every message in the chat, every lie spread about me, every person who had shown up at my apartment based on his posts, all of it created a pattern of deliberate intimidation that crossed multiple legal lines. The prosecutors were particularly interested in how he'd posted my home address, with clear intent to incite others to harass me. As the legal proceedings began, more victims emerged from the shadows. A total of 12 women eventually came forward with stories of Randy's harassment, assault, or career sabotage. Their testimonies revealed a pattern spanning over 15 years, from his first executive chef position through his reign at the Lakeside Grill. The restaurant industry's whisper network had known about Randy for years, but his connections and the fear he inspired had kept victims silent until now. The Lakeside Grill struggled to reopen even after addressing the health violations. The scandal had tainted its reputation, and many customers stayed away, unwilling to support an establishment that had enabled Randy's behavior for so long. William Chen publicly apologized for his failure to see what was happening in his own kitchen and implemented comprehensive harassment training and reporting systems, but the damage was largely irreversible. 3 months later, the restaurant closed permanently. Randy's fall from grace was complete when the Milwaukee Restaurant Association revoked his membership and banned him from all industry events. The Culinary Institute, where he'd occasionally taught as a guest chef, announced that he was no longer welcome on their campus. One by one, every professional organization and network that had given him power distanced themselves from the toxic chef. His attempts to find work at other restaurants were met with immediate rejections. The chat that Randy had used to spread lies about me underwent a transformation. New moderators implemented strict policies against harassment, doxing, and spreading unverified claims about industry professionals. What had been a tool for bullying and intimidation became a resource for sharing legitimate information and supporting workers' rights. Several restaurants even began using it to warn each other about problematic employees or customers, but with strict verification requirements. My work as a health inspector continued, but with a notable change in how I was received at restaurants. Word had spread about my experience and my professionalism in handling it. Kitchen staff, who might have once viewed inspectors as the enemy, now saw me as someone who understood their world and would stand up to abuse. I received messages from workers thanking me for exposing Randy and asking for advice about dealing with their own problematic supervisors. 6 months after that horrible day in the freezer, I received an unexpected invitation. Maria Rossetti, the owner of Bella's Bistro who had turned me away based on Randy's lies, wanted to meet. She apologized profusely for believing Randy's story and explained how his manipulation had worked. She'd known Randy for years, had considered him a colleague and friend, and couldn't conceive that he would lie so brazenly. Her guilt over contributing to my harassment was evident in every word. Maria became one of my strongest advocates in the restaurant community, using her considerable influence to promote better practices and accountability. She instituted an open-door policy for workers to report harassment and became a vocal supporter of regular, unannounced health inspections. Her transformation from skeptic to ally showed how deeply Randy's deception had affected the entire community and how committed many were to preventing such abuse in the future. The legal resolution took over a year, but justice eventually prevailed. Randy was convicted of assault, false imprisonment, and cyberstalking. His sentence included jail time, substantial fines, and a restraining order preventing him from contacting me or any of the other victims. The civil suits filed by multiple women resulted in significant financial judgments that wiped out his savings and forced him to sell his assets. The man who had once lived in a luxury apartment and driven expensive cars was reduced to working minimum wage jobs outside the food industry. The systemic changes inspired by the case were perhaps more important than Randy's individual punishment. The Wisconsin Restaurant Association developed new guidelines for preventing and addressing workplace harassment. The health department implemented additional protections for inspectors, including panic buttons and mandatory paired inspections for establishments with histories of inspector intimidation. Several culinary schools added courses on professional ethics and workplace rights to their curricula. My colleague inspectors shared their own stories of intimidation and harassment they'd faced over the years, but had never reported. Randy was far from the only chef who used bullying tactics against inspectors, though he was certainly among the worst. Together, we developed new protocols for documenting and reporting such incidents, ensuring that future inspectors wouldn't face these situations alone and unsupported as I had. A year after the incident, I was promoted to senior inspector and given responsibility for training new health department employees. I made sure each trainee understood not just the technical aspects of food safety, but also how to maintain their professionalism and safety in hostile environments. My experience became a case study in what not to tolerate and how to respond when faced with abuse of power. The women Randy had victimized formed an informal support network that met monthly. We shared not just our trauma, but our triumphs as well, celebrating as members got new jobs, opened their own restaurants, or achieved other goals that Randy had tried to prevent. Rose, who had been driven out of Milwaukee by Randy's harassment, returned to open her own catering company. Her success was the ultimate repudiation of Randy's attempts to destroy her career. Randy's story became a cautionary tale in culinary schools and professional kitchens. The chef who had seemed untouchable, whose network and reputation had let him abuse workers with impunity for years, had been brought down by his own arrogance and cruelty. His name became synonymous with the toxic kitchen culture that the industry was working to leave behind. Young chefs learned about him as an example of how not to run a kitchen and treat staff. I sometimes wondered what might have happened if I hadn't decided to visit kitchens unofficially that day, if I'd simply shown up on Monday in my official capacity for a scheduled inspection. Randy probably would have been on his best behavior, the violations hidden or minimized, his treatment of staff temporarily improved. He might have continued his reign of terror indefinitely. But his inability to see beyond his own power, to recognize that the woman he was abusing might be more than she appeared, had been his downfall. The Milwaukee restaurant scene transformed in the wake of the scandal. Kitchens that had once tolerated or even celebrated Randy's style of aggressive, abusive leadership began promoting different values. Collaboration replaced intimidation, mentorship replaced harassment, and professionalism replaced the toxic machismo that had allowed predators like Randy to thrive. Young chefs coming up in this new environment would never understand how someone like Randy had been allowed to operate for so long. My apartment building, which had been the site of so much harassment during those terrible days, became an unexpected symbol of resilience. The management company, embarrassed by their initial response to the harassment, implemented new security measures and policies for dealing with targeted residents. They even commissioned a mural to cover the wall where the spray paint had been, turning an ugly reminder into something beautiful. The mural depicted women in various professions standing strong together. The investigation revealed that Randy's problems extended beyond harassment and food safety violations. Financial irregularities at the restaurant suggested he'd been skimming from both the business and his staff's tip pool. Several employees came forward with evidence that he'd been stealing their tips for years, another form of his power abuse. These additional crimes added to his legal troubles and further destroyed any sympathy he might have garnered from industry colleagues. I continued my work as a health inspector with renewed purpose and insight. Every kitchen I entered, I looked not just for food safety violations, but for signs of the toxic culture that had enabled Randy. When I saw young workers being mistreated or intimidated, I made sure to provide them with resources and let them know their rights. Several times, my willingness to listen and act on their concerns revealed serious problems that went beyond health code violations. The anniversary of the incident passed with mixed emotions. The trauma of those days, the fear and anger and violation, hadn't entirely faded. But alongside those difficult memories were the triumphs, exposing Randy, connecting with other survivors, seeing real change happen in the industry. I'd paid a price for doing my job with integrity, but that price had purchased something valuable: accountability for a predator and hope for future victims. Local journalism played a crucial role in maintaining pressure for change. Restaurant critics and food writers who had once celebrated Randy's culinary skills began examining how they'd contributed to enabling abusive chefs by focusing solely on food quality while ignoring workplace culture. Several prominent publications implemented new review criteria that included treatment of staff and workplace environment alongside traditional metrics like food quality and service. The ripple effects extended beyond Milwaukee as the story gained national attention. Other cities began examining their own restaurant industries for similar patterns of abuse and intimidation. Health inspectors across the country shared their own stories of harassment and intimidation, leading to better protections and protocols. Randy Morrison became a case study in hospitality management programs as an example of leadership failure and its consequences. 2 years after that day in the freezer, I received a letter forwarded through my attorney. It was from Randy, writing from prison where he was serving his sentence. The letter was full of self-pity and attempts at justification, blaming everyone but himself for his downfall. He claimed I'd misunderstood his intentions, that his behavior had been misinterpreted, that the restaurant industry had always operated this way. I filed the letter with the rest of the documentation, another piece of evidence of his inability to accept responsibility. The women he'd victimized had moved on in various ways. Some stayed in the restaurant industry, determined to create better environments than the ones they'd experienced. Others left food service entirely, pursuing new careers where their talents weren't overshadowed by fear and harassment. But all of them carried the strength that comes from surviving abuse and seeing justice served. We remained connected, a network of support born from shared trauma and shared triumph. My role evolved beyond traditional health inspection to include advocacy and education. I spoke at industry conferences about creating safe workplace environments and the real costs of tolerating abusive behavior. Restaurant owners who had once viewed health inspectors as adversaries began inviting me to consult on creating better workplace cultures. The inspector who Randy had tried to destroy became a voice for positive change throughout the industry. The legal precedents set by Randy's case made it easier for future victims to seek justice. The documentation standards we'd established, the patterns we'd proven, the network of support we'd created, all of it became a template for addressing workplace harassment in restaurants. Law firms specializing in employment law cited our case when representing other victims. The price Randy paid for his abuse became a deterrent for others who might have followed his example. Looking back, I sometimes marveled at how Randy's arrogance had been his undoing. If he'd shown even basic courtesy to someone he perceived as powerless, if he'd controlled his predatory impulses for just one morning, he might have continued his abusive reign indefinitely. But bullies like Randy can't help themselves. They're compelled to abuse any perceived vulnerability to demonstrate their power at every opportunity. That compulsion, that inability to see others as fully human, had finally brought consequences he couldn't escape. The restaurant industry in Milwaukee became known for its progressive workplace policies and zero tolerance for harassment. What had once been a cautionary tale became a success story of how change was possible when people stood up to abuse. Young professionals chose to work in Milwaukee specifically because of its reputation for protecting workers. The city that Randy had tried to turn against me became a model for others to follow. My daily work continued with the knowledge that I'd made a real difference. Every safe kitchen, every protected worker, every prevented case of harassment felt like a victory. The health inspector Randy had tried to break had instead broken the cycle of abuse he represented. And in kitchens across the city, workers knew they had someone who would listen, who would act, who would ensure their safety was just as important as food safety. That knowledge, that trust, was worth everything I'd endured. The transformation wasn't just in policies and procedures, but in the culture itself. Kitchens that had once echoed with cruel laughter at someone's humiliation now fostered mentorship and growth. The young cooks who had watched Randy abuse me learned a different way to lead, one based on respect and professionalism rather than fear and intimidation. They would carry those lessons forward, creating kitchens where talent flourished without trauma. As I sit here now, preparing for another day of inspections, I think about all the women Randy silenced, all the careers he destroyed, all the dreams he shattered before that day. He made the mistake of targeting me. I carry their stories with me into every kitchen, ensuring their suffering wasn't in vain. Randy Morrison wanted to destroy me for refusing to submit to his abuse. Instead, his actions destroyed the very system that had protected him for so long. And in that destruction, we built something better, something safer, something more just. The freezer he locked me in became the cold storage for his own career, and the woman he tried to silence became the voice that finally held him accountable.